So if you're like most people, you've probably noticed that you live in a state. You live in a place where there are rules or laws that you have to follow. And if you don't follow them, the state is going to do bad things to you. You're going to have to pay a fine or do community service or go to jail, or maybe the state will even kill you. But have you ever stopped to wonder what makes the state able to do that to you other than the fact that the state is really strong? This is one of the central questions in political philosophy. What exactly gives the state its legitimacy? What gives the state the power to do things to you other than the fact that it's strong and you're weak? And what rules, if any, does the state have to follow when it applies its rules to you? One way to think about these questions is to imagine a particular state, known as the state of nature. This is the state before there were any societies, before there were any countries or nations or anything that had any sort of laws or rules that individuals had to follow. This is a world where there were only individuals trying to make it on their own. And political philosophers like to use this state of nature because they think if you can imagine what life was like in this state of nature, you might be able to figure out the answer to these important questions in political philosophy. Now, when you think about the state of nature, it's really important to think about what this state of nature looks like. And there are two things that you will want to consider. Number one, when someone's talking about a state of nature, are they talking about a theoretical state of nature, or are they talking about a state of nature that actually existed? Some political philosophers will tell you that the state of nature was really just imaginary. It never actually existed, and we talk about the state of nature in political philosophy because it just gives us a really useful and helpful way to think about what sorts of rules we would agree to in sort of like theoretical circumstances. And if we can understand the rules we would agree to in theoretical circumstances, we might understand what justifies the rules in our actual circumstances. On the other hand, there are political philosophers who will tell you that the state of nature was a real thing. There really was a time before society actually existed, and whether or not society is justified or whether or not our state is justified depends really crucially on how we got from the real state of nature to our real societies today. The second question you'll want to look at when you're looking at a state of nature is whether or not the philosopher you're looking at thinks that the state of nature was good or bad. Some philosophers, very famously Jean-Jacques Rousseau, thought that the state of nature was wonderful. It's a state where we were naturally peaceful and caring towards each other. And there's something about living in a state, living in a society, that's what actually makes us selfish and makes us want to harm other people. On the other hand, there are philosophers, for example Thomas Hobbes, who thought that the state of nature was not only very real, but was really, really bad and something that should be avoided at all costs. Now, this is a really important question because whether or not you think the state of nature is good or bad is going to tell you a lot about what you think the state should look like and what the state should be able to do. If you think the state of nature is generally speaking pretty good, you'll probably imagine a state that has very few restrictions on individual liberty, for example. On the other hand, if you think that the state of nature was really, really bad and should be avoided at all costs, then you're probably going to be more comfortable with a state that is going to impose more restrictions on its citizens and be able to say that citizens can or can't or must do certain things because we are trying to avoid the very bad state of nature. Now, what the state of nature looks like from philosopher to philosopher or from theory to theory is really important and something that you should look at when you look at any political theory, really. But when you're looking at the state of nature, there are sort of two things that you'll want to watch out for as far as problems that a particular state of nature might come up with. Number one is you'll want to make sure that whatever the state of nature you're looking at is at least in some way recognizable. It looks like something that we could either theoretically imagine or we could say maybe even actually existed. If you have a state of nature that is too different from anything that we would recognize, it's going to be really hard to say that whatever political theory comes out of that state of nature is going to be applicable to our everyday lives. The second thing that you'll want to look at is whether or not the state of nature either romanticizes or demonizes the state of nature unfairly. This happens actually with surprising frequency, especially for philosophers who thought that the state of nature was not only real, but something that could have been observed in their actual lives. For example, by looking at Native American communities in North America, you could see a benevolent and peaceful people who were totally free of any sort of civilization or society. Now, this view was actually fantastically racist. It turns out that Native Americans lived in highly complex and highly developed societies that had laws and had rules and had social codes that everybody followed. On the other hand, if you look at the state of nature as being unduly savage, or there's something about living in a society that basically tames the savage beast, as people used to say in, for example, the 19th century. If you go along with someone like Rudyard Kipling and Edgar Rice Burroughs, two writers who wrote about India and Africa from a European colonial perspective, you wind up with a view of the state of nature as unusually savage and it requiring basically European civilization to bring order to chaos. Again, a really problematic and frankly racist view of what the state of nature, if it actually historically existed, looked like. And if that's the view that you're going to take, it's going to color your political philosophy and what you think the state is and should be. But if you can come up with a reasonable state of nature, a state of nature that is recognizable and doesn't, unfairly paint what the state of nature actually looked like, you'll probably come up with at least a reasonable political philosophy that's worth taking seriously as an idea to justify the state.